Hi, everybody, and good evening. My name is Tzeporah Berman. I'm the chair of the Fossil Fuel Treaty and also the International Program Director at Stand.Earth. I'm actually speaking to you tonight from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations here in Vancouver, Canada. But I'm super excited to be a part of this campaign launch in Toronto. I lived in Toronto for many years, did several degrees in Toronto, and my family still lives in Toronto. So I'm so excited that you're all here tonight and that this campaign is launching in Toronto. I wanted tonight to tell you a little bit of the journey and the story of how the treaty came about, some of the logic behind the fossil fuel treaty so that you can use it in your campaign, and make sure you know of the resources that we prepared for groups like yours around the world who are starting to campaign on the treaty. And so I'm going to try showing my screen. You'll let me know if that's working okay. So if the technology gods are with me, you're seeing one big image that says fossil fuel treaty. Thumbs up? Is that?
Yeah.
Yes. The other day I was doing a presentation to a council, and it turns out the whole time they were looking at my speaking notes and not my slides. So now I'm just checking. So the fossil fuel treaty in part emerged here. And so it's apt that we're talking about it in Canada, although it's now a global project, and there are organizations and cities around the world getting involved in the fossil fuel project. It emerged in part from some of our experience in Canada trying to talk about fossil fuels. And many of you here will know that the fastest growing component of Canada's emissions, and now the largest component competing with transportation, are emissions from the oil and gas sector, specifically from the production of oil and gas. And when I first started realizing this and talking to academics and policymakers and even government about how do we, if we want to move to 100% renewables, and everyone agrees that we need to, in order to ensure climate safety and have a healthier and cleaner and more stable economy, how do we do that if we're still funding and building more and more fossil fuels? And I was told in no uncertain terms that in climate policy and international agreements, we don't deal with the production of fossil fuels. We only talk about emissions and pollution. And for over 30 years, that's been really the way that people thought about climate policy. We deal with demand of fossil fuels. So we try and make sure that the demand goes down, zero emission buildings, zero emission cars, and we try and make sure that the price of carbon goes up. And then the markets will constrain production. So it was a great theory, and we've all tried it out around the world for 30 years, and it didn't work, or at least it's not working fast enough to keep us safe. So what's happening is that the markets are distorted. And so even though fossil fuels are becoming more and more expensive, and now we've had such breakthroughs in technology and clean energy is available and renewables are even cheaper than fossil fuels in most places of the world, we're still seeing this massive build out of fossil fuels. And so a number of academics and advocates and former diplomats from around the world came together through a series of conferences trying to understand what we do about that. And what we realized is it's actually one of the only issues in the world where we're not actually simultaneously dealing with the supply of a product that is a problem and the demand at the same time. So how do we do that? How do we do that in domestic policy? How do we do that internationally? And do we need new international agreements? And that's kind of what started us on this journey about 2 years ago. So I'm going to try and give you the sum up of how we answered that question. 2 years and 8 minutes. I'm up for the challenge. So first of all, the logic of the treaty starts here. For many years, the World Economic Forum identified the greatest threat to humanity as weapons of mass destruction. That's the little red bubble in the top left of that graph. And the World Economic Forum identified weapons of mass destruction as having the greatest impact on the global community and also the most likely impact on the global community. Well, in 2020, that changed. And now the World Economic Forum identifies failure to mitigate climate change, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, water crises, natural disasters as the greatest threat to humanity and the most likely threat to humanity. So why is that important for the fossil fuel treaty? Because climate change and solutions to climate change are complicated. But what we know is that 80% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere since the industrial age, 80% of the emissions come from three products: oil, gas, and coal. So how are we doing in phasing out those products and moving towards solutions? Well, I mean, I think everyone here knows that even the commitments under the Paris Accord don't add up to enough to keep us safe. And we constantly hear targets from our governments and plans from our governments and then failure to meet those targets. Why is that happening? And why doesn't it add up to enough? Part of the answer came from this report that the United Nations Environment Programme and Stockholm Environment Institute put out for the first time 2 years ago, where they looked at the production of fossil fuels, not just the emissions from fossil fuels, but the production. And what they found is that we are on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels than the world can safely burn under a 1.5 degree scenario. 120% more fossil fuels. That's an important number for this campaign. So what does that really mean? I always find these bar graphs actually super useful because they show kind of the inconsistency with the 1.5 degree goal and how much fossil fuels we're building. Even if global coal use was phased out overnight, if cement emissions were drastically reduced, carbon emissions from the oil and gas and operating fields would push the world beyond 1.5 degree warming. It would make it impossible to meet our global obligations under the Paris Agreement. So a couple weeks ago, as many of you know, the landscape on these issues changed, and our kind of theory of change and our analysis of why we need a fossil fuel treaty was reinforced by the International Energy Agency, not a radical body, usually one of the most conservative bodies on energy, confirmed our research and the research that you saw in the production gap report. And they concluded in their net zero and 1.5 degree scenario that there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in a net zero pathway. So when I talk about these issues around the world, one of the first questions I get is, well, wait a minute, what about the Paris Accord? So I will actually never forget the day when I asked myself that question, hearing rumors that although there are some mechanisms through a country's filed nationally determined contributions and other mechanisms within the Paris Accord, what were the ways that we were trying to constrain coal, oil, or gas or fossil fuels within the Paris Accord? I started simply by actually searching for the terms coal, oil, gas, fossil fuels, and found that they don't exist in the Paris Agreement. And I think that is actually really telling. Of course, it's simplistic, but it is telling. It's like fitting production agreements and production decline scenarios into a global agreement that is really about negotiating the space left in our atmosphere for pollution is a little bit like a square peg into a round hole, which doesn't mean that the Paris Agreement is not important. What it means is that it needs parallel and complementary other international agreements and efforts in order to meet the Paris goals. So we're not trying to replace the Paris Agreement with a new fossil fuel treaty. What we're saying is if we're able to reach agreement to end expansion of fossil fuels and the negotiations required in order to support countries in doing that, that will set us up to meet the goals of the Paris Accord. So why do we need international cooperation? I think this research that was initially published by Shivan Kartha and Greg Mutit on equity in production decline helps us answer that question, because underlying all of our work is that the scale of the challenge, the urgency, and the fact that so many countries face capacity constraints and can't undertake a just transition on their own is why we need international cooperation. So if you look at this chart, well, there's no doubt that all fossil fuel producing countries face major challenges. If you look at countries like the US or Canada or the UK on the left of the chart, not only do we have more diversified economies, but we're not as dependent on oil revenues for taxation or the provision of government services as many countries from the global south. I do a lot of work in the Amazon, And what I know about Ecuador's new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon is that they're doing it in large part just to feed their debt, because they have a debt for oil swap with China. They can't stop expansion of fossil fuels unless there are some negotiations around debt forgiveness, international cooperation, and support. So one of the basis of our work is doing research and designing new discussions around equity and who gets to produce what fossil fuels, for how long, and how much. We've organized the work of the treaty roughly within the same framework as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the first as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The first pillar is non-proliferation. Let's not add to the problem. We know that we need to end exploration and expansion of new reserves of fossil fuels. We have more than enough fossil fuels either above ground or currently under development to meet the world's needs while we transition to an electrified, renewable, and cleaner future. And in fact, last week, the Fossil Fuel Treaty released a report called Fossil Fuel Exit Strategy, which shows extensive modeling and data to prove that point that you can find on our website. So following the nuclear weapons treaties as a model, we've identified the 3 pillars, but we're not just using the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're also looking at examples from other treaties, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. That international agreement happened in part because of massive global civil society momentum from countries who actually weren't the biggest suppliers stepping up and saying, yes, we need to end expansion. And cities played a huge role in achieving that. I'm going to jump over the risks of climate disruption because I think this audience definitely knows it. This PowerPoint will be made, and the talking points will be made available to all of you and is available on our website. But I'm going to stop here for 1 second on the risks of delay. A lot of people say, you know what, it doesn't matter how much we produce. Climate change is only about emissions and how much emissions get trapped in our atmosphere. But here's why production and infrastructure is important. Because if we delay tackling fossil fuel supply, then our intellectual, our financial, and our political capital will continue to go to building more and more fossil fuels, and that starves out the infrastructure that we need on renewables, the budgets that cities need in order to build the solutions that we want. It makes the transition harder. It creates stranded assets and financial turmoil, risks to workers and communities. We're actually not asking for something radical. We're asking for a plan. Our governments have all said that we need to phase out fossil fuels, that we need to get to net zero, beyond zero of fossil fuel emissions, but we do not have plans in place in Canada or many other supply side countries around the world to phase out fossil fuels. If we had a plan in place, then we could ensure that no workers or their families are left behind. But that means acknowledging what the production levels need to be and capping expansion now and putting in place a plan for a globally negotiated just transition. So in summary, our objectives are pretty big, but they're starting to work around the world. We want to change the global norm on fossil fuels. Yes, for many years, for many of us, we grew up with the idea that fossil fuels are prosperity, that expanding fossil fuels is essential to our economy. That's not true anymore. And now these 3 products, coal, oil, gas, fossil fuels, are actually a major threat to our health and to our security. We want to provide a missing framework and mechanism in the climate debate to grow the global movement for a just transition and motivate cities and states to endorse the treaty and push on national governments to create the international cooperation that we need. We want to increase transparency and accountability on who's developing what. Our research is showing that over 70%, close to 80% of all the new planned oil and gas in the next 5 years globally is in North America. So wealthy countries are planning to expand the production of fossil fuels. And a lot of people don't know that. We need transparency on who's planning, who's doing it, and where. So we've created an ecosystem, hubs of groups around the world who are working on this campaign, cities who are collaborating to learn about how they can stop fossil fuels, a diplomatic engagement team to develop a political strategy, and a communications team, as well as a research team that's starting to develop the principles and research necessary under each pillar of the treaty. It's taken off quickly. We only launched in September. We now have over 400 groups from around the world who are participating in the treaty campaign. We've developed a campaign hub, which we'll put a link for in the chat, that has all the resources that groups and cities and all over the world can use to run a treaty campaign. And we've started to get some pretty amazing traction and support. Many of you will have seen that during the Biden summit, 100 Nobel laureates supported the concept, including the Dalai Lama. Already many cities around the world have endorsed. Vancouver was the first, and I'm really excited that we have Councillor Christine Boyle here with us tonight, followed by Barcelona, Los Angeles, and now several cities in Australia and New Zealand. The city's work is really taking off. So I'm really excited that Toronto is going to be a part of this campaign and this conversation. And I want to pass the mic over to Seble Samuels, who is the Fossil Fuel Treaty Cities Coordinator, to tell you a little bit more of why we think cities are so critical in this fight. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Tzeporah. And just before you start, Seble, I'd just like to point out that we did send invitations to the city councillors, to the members of provincial parliament and the MPs. And I'm pleased to say that MPP Jill Andrew has joined us here tonight. She's from my riding of Toronto St. Paul's. So thank you for coming. And if there are other politicians present, please identify yourself in the chat, introduce yourselves, and thank you very much for coming and learning with all of us. So over to Seble.
Thank you so much, all of you. My name is Seble. I recently joined the treaty campaign as the Global Cities Campaign lead, and I'm really excited to be joining all of you today. So as Tzeporah was mentioning, Vancouver, LA, Barcelona, councils across the UK, including an ex-coal mining town, councils in Australia, including the Australian Capital Territory in Canberra and Moreland Council in Melbourne, all have in common that they have committed to and endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and the 3 pillars of stopping fossil fuel expansion, phasing out existing reserves, and building a global just energy transition. We're super excited that climate justice movements and city councillors are campaigning to make this a reality in Toronto. It's a super important and strategic city to continue to put pressure on Canada to endorse the treaty and building pressure from below. So thank you all for the important work you're doing and mobilizing collectively for the treaty. I really want to stress that the role of cities is a critical and essential piece of the treaty campaign, as they play a really influential role in influencing national governments to take action. And as Tzeporah was showing in previous treaties, historically with the nuclear non-proliferation movement and the declaration of hundreds of cities as nuclear weapons free zones, they were really able to put pressure on their national governments from below to take bold, urgent, and collective action on nuclear disarmament. And we think that similarly, the role of cities in the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, this campaign can also play a really influential role. We've seen, over the past years and decade that cities are really being hard hit by the climate emergency. There's been heat waves, flooding, growing wildfires across Australia, in the state of California, that are really creating escalating and ongoing infrastructure costs for cities to adapt to the climate crisis if action is not taken. And cities are also leaders in climate action, and the treaty is a way to backstop leadership that is happening at the city level that is being undercut by fossil fuel expansion. We've also seen hundreds of cities around the world declare climate emergencies, but the fossil fuel industry continues to expand. Tzeporah mentioned the overshoot of 120% that would happen beyond a 1.5 degree pathway if we're not able to stop expansion and phase out reserves. So the treaty endorsement can really reinforce these motions and send a powerful signal to national governments on fossil fuel phase out and a just transition. And in the time of the pandemic that we're all going through, cities are really rapidly reshaping their budgets and trying to build back a different world. We need to ensure that this stimulus and money is dedicated to a just energy transition and not in the support of fossil fuels as historically has been done. So cities are really a key piece in building the momentum for this treaty. And in cities across the world, different campaigns, different treaty campaigns are being unleashed by climate justice campaigners and progressive city councillors to help bring this treaty to life and ensure this global fossil fuel phase out and a just transition. So I wanted to spotlight a few examples and highlight that you are all in wonderful company in the campaign that you're launching in Toronto. In the city of Bonn, Germany, which we all know is really significant as it's the headquarters of the Secretariat of the UNFCCC. Earlier this month on World Environment Day, Campaigners in the city of Bonn did a grassroots action and announced a citizens proposal to the city council for treaty endorsement. They're going to be having webinars with climate networks and developing working groups and translating and localizing their content in the coming weeks, and officially launching their campaign next month. Friends of the Earth Sweden is also running a campaign in multiple Swedish cities to endorse the treaty, especially in the lead up to Stockholm Plus 50, which is taking place 50 years after the very first conference on the human environment that happened in 1972. New York City is also has an ongoing campaign with city councilors that are trying to pick up the momentum for the treaty, which will accelerate after the city elections that happen next week. In Sudbury, also on World Environment Day, youth from Fridays for Future staged an action calling for the greater city of Sudbury to endorse the treaty. And in the city of Amsterdam, there's been work with city campaigners in the Green Party to endorse the treaty, which they intend to do this year. There's also been really good supply side work at the city level to limit the social licensing of fossil fuels. They've successfully banned fossil fuel advertisements in the city. There's a strong fossil-free culture movement to end fossil fuel sponsorship of the public cultural institutions, and a campaign for fossil-free politics. So these are also things that can be taken on once treaties have been endorsed to really ensure that the treaty has teeth. And we're also pushing for Global South cities to endorse in this call for a global just transition, and especially because equity and justice is at the center of it. And we recognize that countries such as Canada have these massive carbon footprints and have the historical and current responsibility to support financing and leading a global just transition. I'm Ethiopian Canadian and normally based in Addis Ababa, and across the continent of Africa, there's been probably only 3% of global emissions, but still we're facing locust outbreaks, flooding, drought. And so there really needs to be, climate justice put forward. And the role of cities and everything you're collectively leading is massively important in kind of changing course and making fossil fuels part of history. So we're so grateful that you're launching this campaign in Toronto. Please reach out if you need any support. We're super grateful for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seble. That was a great introduction to the city's campaign. It's now my pleasure to welcome Sabaa Khan, the Director of Climate Solutions at the David Suzuki Foundation. Welcome, Sabaa.
Thank you, Lynn. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging that my work takes place in Tiohtià:ke on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I have a few moments to speak to you today, and I'd like to take this time to address why a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is of critical importance to Canada from the perspective of Indigenous rights. Indigenous Climate Action is an Indigenous-led organization, which many of you may be familiar with. They released a report last March on decolonizing climate policy in Canada. I encourage everyone who's not yet read that report to do so. It lays out clearly, through a critical analysis of Canada's pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, and the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy plan, the massive problem with Canada's existing climate policy solutions. The report by Indigenous Climate Action is unequivocally clear. The root causes of the climate crisis remain unaddressed under Canada's climate policy. Incentives to reduce fossil fuel use in Canada are multiplying, and at the same time, these incentives ignore the realities of Indigenous livelihoods. Moreover, they promote the continuation of fossil exports. In this way, they continue the support and the survival of industries that have had a disproportionate impact on the health and environment, on basically a disproportional burden on Indigenous peoples. Not only is the fossil fuel industry the main driver of the climate crisis, it has contributed to the vulnerabilization of Indigenous communities across Canada. Addressing and transforming colonial relations must be an integral, perhaps the most fundamental aspect of our climate policy. Canada's wealth is based on extractivism, a pattern of extractivism that is inherently linked to the oppression and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. Oil sands tailing ponds stored near the Athabasca River in Alberta have been leaking for decades. More than 1 trillion liters of toxic oil sands are stored there. And this is the part of our export-oriented fossil economy that goes unaddressed when we talk about GDP and growth. This legacy of environmental racism towards Indigenous peoples cannot continue unless we need to completely annihilate any possibilities for future growth of fossil fuel industries. Another major reason that we should be addressing the supply side of fossil fuels is the Arctic. Now, it is widely acknowledged that Arctic warming has had a profound impact on Indigenous communities. It is a threat to self-determination and human rights. And at the same time, the melting Arctic is seen as an investment opportunity with significant quantities of gas and oil. We need to shut down the possibility of gas and oil exploration in the Arctic for all countries. And why is this even more problematic in the case of Canada? Former UN Special Rapporteurs on the rights of Indigenous peoples, James Anaya included, have identified natural resource extraction on Indigenous territories as one of the foremost concerns of Indigenous peoples worldwide. Existing research from Amnesty International, UN Women, the Natives Women's Association of Canada, and from Inuit women provide evidence that within Indigenous communities, natural resource extraction projects impact women differently, more acutely, and more negatively. And yet there's very little research on the gendered dimensions of resource development in Canada. The UN Special Rapporteur and others have pointed to the presence of extractive industry projects in communities as being associated with gender-based violence. Now, I'd like to turn for a moment to the global treaty. Why do we need a global treaty? It's understood that we are in a period of transformative change. We need a new global social contract. We need a new norm for the international community. And why should it be in the form of a treaty? There's strongly held perceptions that some legal bindingness can promote greater effectiveness in nurturing amongst its signatory states a deeper sense of compliance as being not just optional, but compulsory. Negotiations for the Paris Agreement were launched just 4 years before its conclusion. And this is proof that even while many international agreements take a very long time to negotiate, when states feel similar pressure to take action, multilateral negotiations can lead to swift agreement. A treaty is by far the preferred approach from a human health and environmental perspective. And this is a treaty that would fill a huge gap in international and climate policy. The failure of our international and national legal frameworks to wind down fossil fuel production ultimately affects human rights, Indigenous rights, and ecosystem health across the globe. We cannot simply keep relying on market-based solutions. Carbon pricing has specific disproportionate impacts on Indigenous peoples when it comes to also output pricing systems, the way that we price carbon from industries. Unless we want to have a really fair and equitable approach to climate policy worldwide, we cannot, continue ignoring supply side problems. And in this respect, international law is the only solution that can really be effective. We have a history of negotiating treaties on hazardous substances, on limiting asbestos, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, even hazardous pesticides are closely regulated. And yet the one resource that is responsible for massive public health crisis at this moment remains completely unaddressed. So I'd like to end it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sabaa. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd also just like to acknowledge that MPP Peter Tabbins is here, my MPP, so it's great to have you. It's great to have you here. So now I'd like to, it's now my pleasure to introduce Catherine Abreu, the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm calling in today from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in what's also known as Ottawa. So in the few minutes that I have, given the amazing words that we've already heard from some of our brilliant fellow panelists, I just want to begin by saying, while I'm here in Ottawa today, I did grow up in Toronto, and so it is really personally exciting for me to see this campaign launching, and really appreciate being able to be here with all of you. And I think the thing that I really want to focus in on is the way in which our current, our society's current relationship with the fossil fuel industry puts a limit on how we can envision a just and equitable society. And that is, I think, a visioning set that many of us are compelled by, and that many of us undertake in our community settings. But we are often met with resistance when we try to implement the vision for this just and equitable communal way of living in the world. And often a great source of that resistance comes from the oil and gas industry and those who have their backs. But I'll of course start by talking about the fact that the oil and gas sector is not only the largest source of emissions domestically here in Canada, but it is also our largest export of emissions. And so the emissions from Canada's oil and gas industry, when we transport those products around the world and they eventually get burned in other parts of the world, probably far exceed our domestic emissions. Although we haven't yet done the calculation to crunch those numbers, we know that they're very high. And so when we think about our country's responsibility to address the climate crisis, I think it's necessary for us to think about that not only in light of science, so taking into account how many emissions, how many particles of CO2 we have to cut here, but what our responsibility is to the world to acknowledge our historical responsibility for the climate crisis and our capacity to take action on that crisis. So Canada has been in the top 10 of global net emitters of greenhouse gases for the last century. We have never left that spot. And again, that is on a net basis. And on a per capita basis, Canadians emit more per person than pretty much anyone anywhere else in the world. So we obviously have a current and historical responsibility for the problem. And as one of the 10 wealthiest nations on the planet, we have the capacity to take action on that problem. And given the fact that the oil and gas industry is such a large source of emissions here in Canada, it makes sense that we want to tackle those emissions first to drive those domestic emissions down here in Canada, but to also help drive emissions reductions globally. And then, as I think Sabaa from David Suzuki Foundation said so eloquently, the oil and gas industry is also one of the ways in which colonialism gets perpetuated here in Canada and worldwide. And so not only do we need to be thinking about the ways in which confronting the entrenched interests of the oil and gas industry is necessary for us to take action here at home, to take action abroad on the climate crisis, but it is also a necessary element for us as we seek to address the historical and current injustices that are embedded in our social and economic systems, many of which are the legacy of the extractive colonial systems that those social and economic institutions were built on. So I said that I am interested in speaking to you for a few minutes about the ways in which the oil and gas industry not only is a huge source of emissions in Canada, but is a great limit to our imagination. And there are a few ways in which that functions. So first of all, the oil and gas industry has perpetuated a multi-billion-dollar, decades-long campaign to undermine climate science and public understanding of the climate crisis. And I think this is really critical to perpetuate the myth of personal responsibility for the climate crisis. And so making sure that we rid our public discourse from this really negative influence that has consistently questioned the science of climate change and told us that, yeah, maybe even if climate change exists, it's all on you for wanting the services that these fossil fuels provide, and so it's your responsibility to fix it. And therefore, by putting it on our individual plates, it makes it seem like the climate crisis is impossible to resolve. They have continued to undermine our political and public consensus for taking action on the crisis. But I think one of the biggest lessons we can take home from the pandemic is how little emissions reductions are actually associated with very radical personal behavioral change. So in the first months of the pandemic, when most people around the world were doing basically nothing, not flying anywhere, driving a whole lot less, there was way less consumer products moving around the world, global emissions dropped at their peak by about 17%. And overall, over the course of the pandemic year, emissions will have dropped between 7 and 8% is what scientists are predicting. So that means that the vast majority of emissions, well over 80% of emissions, are coming from industrial sources that for the most part, we members of the public have no control over in our individual consumer based decision making every day. And a huge part of that, of course, is in the oil and gas industry. Other ways in which that limit on imagination functions is in government capture. So academic research has found that in Canada, the fossil fuel interests led by oil and gas companies and industry associations had on average 11,000 meetings with Canadian governments between 2011 and 2018. That's almost 4 meetings per day, every single day of the year for almost a decade. And not only do we see this capture in governments in Canada, but also in the banks. So our banks are very overly leveraged on the oil and gas industry here in Canada. And that puts a limit on the extent to which capital is free to flow to the solution. So it means that there isn't a level playing ground between the fossil fuel industry in Canada and those who are emerging in the new, cleaner economy. And finally, a huge part of what underpins that unlevel playing field, and I'm sure one of our next speakers will talk a fair amount about this, is the extent to which fossil fuel subsidies are provided to that industry from public coffers. And so here we are in multiple ways, the fossil fuel industries in Canada and around the world have limited our ability to take action on climate change, and also limited our ability to imagine what an economy, a society, a culture without an addiction to fossil fuels looks like. And so I'm here today to say that I think this campaign, along with the many other campaigns that are launching in Canada and other parts of the world right now, to make sure we turn our focus to supply side efforts so that we are, as many people will say, cutting with both sides of the scissors, trying to address climate change from both the demand side and the supply side of the problem. This is the way in which we might be able to not only drive those emissions reductions as deep as we need to go to hold warming to that 1.5 threshold, but to also free ourselves up to think through the just and equitable transition that we need to make to a society and an economy that works better for people as well as the planet. So thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to hearing the next speakers.
Thank you so much. So now I'm really happy to introduce Julia Levin, Climate and Energy Program Manager with Environmental Defense. It's so great to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen. And thanks to all the speakers before me and to Kat for that awesome segue, because what I'm going to be talking about are fossil fuel subsidies. So my name is Julia Levin. I work with Environmental Defense, and I'm joining you tonight from the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe Territory, Ottawa. And I was invited to speak on the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, since a key component of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is getting rid of the financial supports, the public financial supports that prop up the fossil fuel sector. So in Canada, on one hand, we're setting climate targets and we're developing climate plans, but on the other hand, we're still spending more on supporting the oil and gas sector than we are on climate solutions. So earlier this year, we released a report showing that in 2020, the federal government announced a minimum of nearly $18 billion that went to oil and gas companies. And I'll note that that's an underestimation since there's so little transparency from the federal government on subsidies. For example, we know there's a bunch of tax breaks, but we don't know how much foregone revenue there is as a result of those tax breaks. There's no transparency around that. And also this number does not include provincial subsidies, which for some provinces are also billions of dollars each year. So this is a huge amount of public support. So that the $18 billion number includes both subsidies and public financing. So I'll break that down a little bit. Fossil fuel subsidies are things like direct spending or tax breaks, like I mentioned before, tax incentives. So they can, on the direct spending, that includes things like providing companies with funds to do research into new technology to lower their costs of operating. It could be things like paying for infrastructure, for roads, or for gas turbines for oil and gas operations, or letting oil and gas companies off the hook for cleaning up their own mess, like we've done with with inactive oil and gas wells, where oil and gas companies have been promising for decades to clean up their own mess, and instead we've taken some of that onto the public purse. And I will situate, like, our 18 billion number was subsidies and public financing. That doesn't cover the entire cost of what fossil fuels cost to society. There's also huge amounts that we are allowing oil and gas companies to cost our society through externalities like costs, healthcare costs associated with burning fossil fuels, or some of those cleanup costs I was talking about. So that's the direct spending, and the direct spending in 2020 was somewhere, again, federal government, somewhere in between $2 to $3 billion. So the most of the financial support to fossil fuels is actually through public finance, and public finance tools are government-backed loans, grants, equity, bonds, insurance, all of these kinds of financial institutions that come from public bodies. And in Canada, most of the public financing for oil and gas is provided by our export credit agency, Export Development Canada. It's a Crown corporation. Its mandate is to help Canadian businesses operating abroad. In the last 10 years, its mandate has really radically changed to supporting domestic businesses. And every year, Export Development Canada provides an average of $13 billion in support to oil and gas companies. This is the Crown corporation that's funding the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. In 2020, there was about $5 billion made available for TMEX. They also, Export Development Canada, also in 2020 provided a $500 million loan for the Coastal GasLink pipeline. So it's a government body bankrolling pipelines, as well as other kinds of oil and gas operations. So $18 billion is a huge amount of funding. Again, that's an underestimation, but why should we care about fossil fuel subsidies? Why is it so important that we eliminate these? Obviously, subsidies contribute to climate change by making it cheaper to produce, export, trade fossil fuels. They also hurt our health. It's basically, governments propping an industry that is killing us. A recent study found 1 in 5 premature deaths is caused by air pollution. That's 36,000 people in Canada each year. Really important for the purposes of non-proliferation treaty is that allocation of scarce government resources. That's $18 billion that isn't going to other priorities, including climate solutions and a just transition. And government resources are scarce. How we decide to use them is incredibly important for determining the pathways that our country takes. They also obviously distort the energy market. They favor oil and gas over renewable energy. They actually yield very little in terms of job creation. The fossil fuel sector provides fewer jobs per unit of output than any other major sector of the economy. They undermine our other climate policies, and public financing delays the energy transition in other countries as well. On a global stage, Canada's a laggard. We provide more subsidies per capita than any other G7 country. When it comes to public financing specifically, we rank second worst in the G20 and worst on a per capita basis. And at the same time, global momentum to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and shift our public financing is snowballing. The United Kingdom has put in place a policy just this year, and it will no longer provide public financing to overseas fossil fuel projects. President Biden has made eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and public finance a priority, and his proposed budget would eliminate a lot of the country's subsidies if it's approved by Congress. So what do we need to happen in Canada? So at the high level, we need to eliminate all fossil fuel subsidies and public financing, and we need to redirect the support towards scaling up the climate solutions and a just transition. So one hand, we eliminate, and second hand, we really have to make better decisions on the things that we're providing financial support to. But what are the pieces of that? Like, let's break that down a bit. So we need the government to demonstrate transparency. They need to make all of the ways they provide financial support to the industry public. They need to develop a roadmap. So Canada first announced its commitment to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025 over a decade ago, but we still don't have a roadmap. We don't have a clear plan. We don't have timelines. We have nothing that will help us hold the government accountable to meeting this promise. As I said, federal subsidies are only one part of the larger picture. So we really need the federal government to show leadership and work with provinces and territories to eliminate those subsidies. And we also just lastly need to attach strict conditions to government spending programs. Over the last year, Canada has committed over $10 billion in new spending towards decarbonizing heavy industry and clean tech programs. But if we don't have robust conditions, and right now we don't, those programs could result in huge levels of new subsidies. So we really need development of programs that align with our climate commitments. And just the last thing I want to say is that we need to keep ramping up pressure on the federal government to keep its promises when it comes to ending subsidies. So having the City of Toronto endorse the treaty would really be a helpful step in continuing to build this pressure on the federal government. And yeah, thanks for having me. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Over to the next speaker.
Hi everyone, so we're gonna jump into a question and answer now. As a little, we have a time for about 2 to 3 questions, 5 or 6 minutes. So yeah, if anyone has questions for any of our speakers, please put them in the chat or Aaron will ask them. And yeah, so the first question, one question we got was, when talking about fossil fuel subsidies and reducing them, does that include reducing subsidies to petrochemical companies, including for plastics and pesticides used in conventional agriculture, and replacing that with subsidies for organic regenerative agriculture and local recycled glass and stainless steel? So if anyone wants to give that a go, I can also post that in the chat.
Is that one for you?
I can jump in if anyone wants to build off of. So yeah, we are seeing huge levels of subsidies going to petrochemical industry too now, into all kinds of like either straight up greenwashing or just the petrochemicals, which is really significant because we know more and more oil and gas will actually be used for the creation of plastics. So it's another major supply side issue that we need to take seriously. And there's huge programs being set up, especially at the provincial level, around petrochemicals. So that is part of the push to eliminate subsidies to all forms of oil and gas, and that does include petrochemicals. In terms of regenerative solutions, that's part of our arsenal of climate solutions that we really need to be directing financing towards. I don't know if other panelists want to jump in on that.
Well, yeah, just in terms of the treaty, what we're calling for is the end to expansion of and production of all fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal for all their uses. So we're really starting looking at the source, which is, prior to whether or not it's used in petrochemicals, et cetera. And we're in the process of producing right now the first ever prototype for a global registry of fossil fuel production. Because right now the information is not open and transparent about who's producing what or how much. And with nuclear issues, that was really the, kind of one of the first issues that needed to be addressed was, and landmines as well, accountability and transparency on the stockpile, who's producing what and who plans to produce what, so that there can be, it becomes part of the political debate. And so we'll have we created this idea for a global registry of fossil fuel production. Eventually, our goal is to ensure that this is something that countries have to do, that they have to be accountable and submit their data on who's producing what, so we can count up the world's carbon budget. Right now, they're not. And so we're producing a prototype to show how it can be done. And Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor have been hired to produce that prototype, and we'll be releasing it at COP26.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are going to get back to our program, and it's my pleasure right now to introduce Chloe Tse. Chloe is from Fridays for Future Toronto. So Chloe, do you want to take it away? Thank you.
Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Chloe, as mentioned. I'm a youth climate justice activist with Fridays for Future Toronto. Our organization has already endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we're calling on Toronto City Council to sign on as well. In 2019, the city declared a climate emergency and promised to set emission targets in line with keeping the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, as well as pledging to reach net zero emissions by 2050. As of last spring, none of the city's emission targets have been met. Despite acknowledging that the climate crisis emergency is serious, City Council has not adequately stepped up to the challenge with the urgency that is required. And as youth, we're urging Toronto City Council to reaffirm their commitment to addressing the climate crisis by signing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to also follow that up with actions such as creating an equitable low carbon job strategy and giving updates to the public quarterly rather than annually. We will not accept any more broken promises. To make sure this happens, we need everyone here to spread the word about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and to put pressure on City Council and Mayor Tory. Together, we can hold the city accountable. With every day that passes that we don't make commitments and act on them, we get one step closer to climate catastrophe. That's one step closer to an unlivable future for me, my friends, and my family. While I want to have hope for our future, I mostly just feel scared by the lack of action I'm seeing. The time to act is now if we want an Earth that my generation and future generations can be safe in and thrive in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Next up now, it's my pleasure to introduce the award-winning and amazing band, Moscow Apartment, Bridget and Pascal. It's really great to have you here today.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Bridget from Moscow Apartment.
And I'm Pascal.
This is Pascal. So we are a band, and I'm also part of the Canadian branch of Music Declares Emergency Canada, which, if you don't know, is a really great international organization trying to leverage the audience and influence and power that major artists have to convince governments to be better on climate stuff, but also to try to make the music industry itself a more green and eco-friendly industry. And we're gonna play a song for you guys now, but yeah, please go check out Music Declares Emergency and Music Declares Emergency Canada. It's a really, really great organization. This song is called Meredith Palmer, and it's the closest to like a eco song we currently have. Okay, ready?
I collapsed in your canoe, gave my boxes to your mother. I blew up all your balloons when I thought I was a bother. This house keeps growing, we're glowing, and all falling down. Before I know it, we're going. So give me a ride into town. I could be a better daughter, you could be a better son. I'll head straight for the water, but you'll help me when I can't run. Now your mother's at the door, and the kids are all out dancing. When I wash up on the shore, you'll be the only one left standing. This house keeps growing, we're glowing, and all falling down. Before I know it, we're going. So give me a ride into town. I could be a better daughter, you could be a better son. I'd head straight for the water, but you'll help me when I can't run. 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 But you'll help me when I can't run. And I thought I was a bother. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having us. This has been a really amazing event.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the beautiful music. Joining us now is Steve Shallhorn, Executive Director of the Labor Education Center. Steve was Executive Director of Greenpeace in Japan and Campaign Director for the first Greenpeace Canada. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all the previous speakers and to Moscow Apartment, one of my favorite bands. I've had a chance to see them a couple of times live and look forward to the opportunity for doing so again. The Labor Education Center is a project of the Toronto and York Region Labor Council. We're the largest labor council in Canada. And we've recently had a leadership change. John Cartwright, who was the previous president and a very strong supporter of climate action, has now been replaced by Andrea Babington, the first Black woman to lead a labor council in Canada. When I first heard about the non-proliferation, the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, I was thrilled because when I started working as a peace activist in the 1980s and worked on the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and when I started working at Greenpeace, I was actually working on the peace side of the organization, campaigning for nuclear disarmament for many years. And so I agree wholeheartedly with the concept of working on the supply, cutting off the supply of fossil fuels. I'm here to talk a little bit about just transition and the effect of the phase out of fossil fuels and what it will mean for workers and their communities. And those effects are quite serious. But I wanted to mention that just transition does have a long history in Canada, hearkening back to my days as a Greenpeace campaigner, along with Tzeporah Berman. We were, the organization and many other environmental organizations were talking about just transition for workers in plants that created toxins that entered the water or the air and through those avenues into the bodies of workers and those in surrounding communities. So whether that was petrochemical plants or pulp and paper plants that were using chlorine to bleach the paper, and we got all sorts of excuses as to why you couldn't use oxygen instead of chlorine to whiten your toilet rolls. And then in 2000, the Canadian Labour Congress was the first national labor body to adopt a policy of just transition. And many people on this call may know that in the last few years, Canada had a task force on just transition for Canadian coal power workers. And the two chairs of that were a union leader, Hassan Youssef from the Canadian Labour Congress, and an environmentalist, Lois Corbett from the New Brunswick Conservation Council. You know, in the city of Toronto, affected jobs by fossil-free non-proliferation treaty, many of them would be in the distribution and retail operations of fossil fuels. But they would also affect workers in the region's methane plants. Methane, of course, are more commonly known as natural gas plants. But there is one in the Portlands in East Toronto Harbor, and they dot the surrounding area. The workers, the Labour Education Centre has a working green program, and we did a study on what happened to communities, workers, when coal was phased out in Ontario, in Alberta, and 2 locations in Australia. And our research showed that there was either insufficient transition policies for workers in their communities, or in the case of Ontario, no policies whatsoever. Affected workers in the, I think it was 5 coal plants across Ontario, had to rely on their existing collective agreement. They were unionized. But no special provisions were put in either by Ontario Power Generation or the Ontario government that ordered the closure of the plants. No special agreement procedures were put in place for those workers. There's been much research done over the decades what happens to workers in their communities when there's plant closures, especially in communities where that plant is the main employer. And, you know, so it was no surprise to us when we looked at those 4 case studies that the same things happened in those communities. And so what I want to leave you with tonight is an understanding of the cost to individuals and the communities that will be affected by a phase out of fossil fuels. We know that, again, whether it's a planned transition or sort of natural phase out of industries, you know, the coal runs out or the iron ore runs out or whatever, that there's immediate social costs. There's a dramatic rise in domestic violence, in deterioration of family relationships. Almost always there's an immediate drop in real estate prices. One of our communities had an immediate 25% loss in real estate prices, which often is factored into workers' retirement plans. And there's a whole litany of social problems that are caused by these phase outs. And I'll put in the chat the research. The 4 case studies are of course on our website, but I'll finish by saying, you know, that workers and their unions can be a political block to a carbon-free economy, or they can be an accelerator. And clearly we want them to be an accelerator. And maybe one of the things that we should be thinking about is to shift the fossil fuel subsidies to just transition policies that will assist workers and their communities in making the transition. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Oops. Yes, there we are. Thank you very much, Steve. Really appreciate you bringing the workers' perspective. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Tony Sappong. And Dr. Antonia Sappong has spoken at many of our events and links climate and health issues. And Tony's a member of CAPE, and we know the doctor's voice is so important. So thank you for coming, and over to you, Tony.
All right, so thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and part of such an exciting new campaign. So I'm going to just start sharing my slides. Is that all working? Someone give me a thumbs up. I'm going to assume you can all see it. Fantastic. Okay, so I was asked to talk about the connections between human health and fossil fuels. And so when I was brainstorming what to call this, I sort of tongue-in-cheek decided to call this fossil fuels are the new smoking. I feel like probably many of us have heard like sitting is the new smoking. And I have yet to hear fossil fuels be called the new smoking, but I think it's fairly apt, to be honest. So often when we talk about climate change, we think about future health issues, but I thought I would just spend some time talking about the current health issues we're already having from the burning of fossil fuels. There was a study that came out last year, no, not last year, this year in April, that looked at the air pollution generated by the burning of fossil fuels alone and the health impacts that was causing in terms of mortality worldwide. And what the study found was that 1 in 5 deaths were being caused directly by air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. Globally, 8.7 million people died in 2018 from essentially fossil fuels. And to put that into context, so if you look at the deaths from malaria and smoking combined, that's still less than the number of people who died from air pollution in 2018. If you look at the number of COVID deaths we had in 2020, it's about 3 times as high, 3 times higher the number of deaths from air pollution. So clearly a massive public health problem that is being generated by the burning of fossil fuels. And in terms of the reason air pollution is so detrimental to our health is essentially that fine particulate matter, which is what is released by the burning of fossil fuels, gets trapped in our lungs. It causes inflammation, it causes damage to our tissues, leading to things like heart attacks and strokes, cancers, things like dementia. So all sorts of problems. If we look at how this is distributed around the world, to just bring in a bit of an equity piece, you'll notice that most of these deaths are occurring in Eastern Asia. That said, Canada, about 13.6% of all deaths in adults can be attributed to fossil fuels. So not insignificant anywhere, and of course, higher in the global south. Which I guess brings us to the question of then what should we be doing about this? And I think a lot of the speakers have already addressed this very well, but I think it's important to envision, like, it's obvious, I think, if you just take air pollution as the example, that fossil fuels are not good for human health. We need to move away from them. So then the question is not only what do we need to move away from, but what do we need to move towards? And I think there's 2 really important points. One is that a fossil-free world must look different. So in terms of how we're getting around, I chose transportation just because in Canada and a lot of Western countries, a lot of our emissions are coming from actually transportation. So in Canada, transportation and oil and gas production account for about 50% of all our emissions. So, you know, huge room for improvement there. The good news is, so if we shift away from relying on oil and gas for transportation and shift towards electrification, that would be a great step. Like, obviously, air pollution would decrease. It was actually quite remarkable during the pandemic. We saw when people stopped moving around, a reduction in nitric oxide, which is one particular pollutant, by about 60%, and all air pollution, fine particulate matter, by about 30%. So this is a fixable problem, which is really nice. We don't have a huge amount of those, I wouldn't say. So it's always nice when we can get a win. And so, like, obviously electrification is a good idea. What I think is a better idea is a move towards active transportation and a move towards public transportation. There's not enough, you know, recycling capacity to deal with electric cars, for instance, and their batteries. There's huge problems in terms of the extraction of minerals for all of these new electrified technologies that we're thinking about, you know, implementing. So in terms of what I think would be more helpful is a massive investment in active and public transportation. The good news is not only will this reduce air pollution and, you know, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, this will also dramatically improve human health. We know that people who engage in things like biking, cycling, walking running, all of these things, who engage in physical activity have huge reductions in things like heart disease, strokes, type 2 diabetes, hypertension. So all of this to say, shifting away from fossil fuels, great idea. I think it's also important to recognize, to Catherine's point earlier, Canada is a huge contributor and exporter of fossil fuels. We must also tackle and fund the transition away from fossil fuels, not only here, but abroad. The G7 recently met. We're supposed to be, as the G7, we had pledged to reach $100 billion of investments, or not investments, but like as a fund for the poor nations to transition away. We have yet to reach that target. Canada recently increased its commitments, which is great, but we need more to be done. So not only should we be signing on to this non-proliferation treaty, but we also need to keep in mind that we have a responsibility to the rest of the world as well. And I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to introduce Vancouver City Councillor Christine Boyle, who was instrumental in bringing this motion to Vancouver. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I am delighted to be joining you all. I'm joining you from the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and grateful to have been invited and to get to support all of you, support Councillor Layton and other colleagues to move this work forward in Toronto. So I'll just step back a moment and say climate action work has a long history in Vancouver, even at City Hall. Our first city climate report was done in 1989. It's called Clouds of Change. Vancouver's Greenest City Action Plan is a more recent incarnation. And in 2019, Vancouver was the first city in English-speaking Canada to declare a climate emergency. And since then, we've been moving forward with an ambitious and comprehensive climate emergency action plan. The biggest challenge over decades of climate action in Vancouver has been focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and on actually reducing those emissions. So, the unfortunate reality is that while we've done lots of good things, while this has been active work over many political changes in leadership, we haven't reduced our emissions in Vancouver. The Climate Emergency Action Plan that we're moving forward right now is made up of 6 big moves and more than 50 accelerated actions, and it really is focused on our largest sources of emissions, which are buildings and transportation in BC. That means electrifying our buildings, getting rid of natural gas. It also means switching from gas to electric vehicles, but even more so, it means shifting from private vehicles to electrified public transit and active transportation. The Cape folks out here have been doing amazing work on a number of those fronts as well. And it means looking at land use as a climate and an equity issue. And it may not surprise you to know I could talk on and on about each piece of that, but I'm not going to. That's not the point today. The point I want to make is that we need to be engaging in tangible action and advocacy, as the treaty folks say, both the demand and the supply side. So we in Vancouver are doing everything we can within our jurisdiction, or that's certainly the direction I'm pushing in, and folks out here are pushing in. We need everyone else to be doing the same. We can't do it alone, which brings me to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think it's worth noting that when the treaty came to Vancouver, it passed unanimously across a pretty politically diverse, is how I'm going to describe it, a politically diverse council, a council that hasn't always agreed on climate action, especially the more challenging decisions we've had to make. But there was agreement that this treaty was well aligned with our own local efforts. One of the criticisms that I face when I'm advocating for local climate action is that it won't make a difference if others don't act too, which is, of course, a tired excuse for inaction, but it highlights why the treaty matters, I think. It's true that we need to do everything we can within our jurisdiction, particularly focusing really specifically on greenhouse gas emission reductions. But if we're the only ones acting, we risk feeling like chumps. We need everyone acting together, and that's why the treaty is so important. I just want to mention too, to Kat's point earlier about the bombardment of messaging about how the solution is each of us changing our own individual actions. My own experience is that it's been those same folks, that same messaging, who say that the impact of Vancouver acting alone is too small. So, you know, to some degree it's excuses, but I do think we do what we can in each of these spheres, and the power of the treaty is bringing everyone along. So I just want to end by saying that elected leaders need to hear from you all on climate. They need to hear from your residents, lobby us, advocate, organize, create pressure, and create the political space for those of us who are right there with you, and to help us bring along enough votes from colleagues who are more cautious. We need you to speak up and to show up, to have our backs when we're brave, and to push us and others to be more brave. Those who are opposed to change never fail to show up, and your voices and your organizing and your mobilizing need to be bigger than those forces of opposition. And I know from the speakers we've heard, I know from some of the names I recognize on the call, that the incredible and tireless work that you're doing, and I encourage you to continue it and bring more people in and keep growing and keep engaging. The fights that we have ahead require all of us. We want Toronto to join Vancouver in signing the treaty and being global leaders to make a better future possible. We did it in Vancouver, and we know that you can do it too, and I am delighted to help however I can. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christine. It is nice to hear about the great work that's happening in Vancouver, and we certainly hope that we have as much success with the motion here. I'm honored now to introduce to you Michael Layton, Toronto City Councillor. Mike is a longtime supporter of many environmental initiatives here in Toronto, including the Climate Emergency Declaration, and most recently the gas plant motion. We are thankful to have such a wonderful advocate at City Hall. Councillor Layton, a few words.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. And I wasn't expecting to speak, otherwise I may have dressed up a bit, but it's bath time in my household right now, so I'm giving 2 toddlers a bath. Rarely do I wear a collared shirt while I'm doing such a task. Look, to Councillor Boyle, to the other really incredible speakers on this panel, I found it incredibly insightful, as well as just giving or setting the framework, the bedrock for why we should be doing such an important motion. And I think that Councillor Boyle summed it up as, we need your support in order to push councillors forward on this. You know, it seems really easy on things like the climate emergency motion. Like, to be honest, when we started writing that motion, I started writing it for the mayor, and we thought it would be contentious, and it over time grew, support across the city grew. These things take time, they take effort. They don't happen overnight. We can't just walk something on like this onto the floor of council. If we do, you know what, we get a debate. Some councillors think, you know, this is too much, we don't know what this means. There's some legal aspect here we're not seeing. Let's send it back. This happened with the blue dot motion for as part of the David Suzuki Foundation years ago. I put forward a motion not setting up the support for it, and it got pushed back by 1.5 years. We adopted it in the end, but it kept getting pushed back and pushed back. And when motions actually mean something, well, that's when municipal lawyers get a little scared. Their knees get a little weak. And so they start talking and chattering about how they're concerned about it. So we need to make sure that the political support, that the support from your councillors, that most importantly, the support from the mayor will supersede that and say, nope, this is a decision we're making. This is the path we're taking. It's going to have an impact. We're not going to just use words. We're going to make it actually mean something for change. And it came up earlier, we're 1.5 years behind now the recommendations for our second climate plan in the city of Toronto. And I get, like, you know what, COVID delayed things. Like, to their credit, a lot of the Energy and Environment Division agreed to be put out into, or put back out into the public service in order to address our COVID needs and shelters and things like that. But it was already late. So it's really important that we understand the scope of action we need to take now, given we're 2 years behind. Now, those 2 years have also taught us we can work together with others to really make a difference. And so I'm really very enthusiastic about the crowd that we've seen on the call tonight. I hope that we start to light those fires locally in our various wards and across the city, because in order for us to pass a motion like this, we do need councillors do need to see that local support. We've heard from this great panel tonight, and we may be supportive, but not everyone has put this top of mind as it should be. And I look forward to being part of that. And I thank the organizers so much for putting this together, because it really is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. So what I wanted to do now is to give you the action link, because we do have an action link on our website, and we'd really like you to write a letter to your councillor and the mayor. And if you're from another jurisdiction, if you're not from another municipality, we hope you'll take up the campaign there. We will also be putting up the bios for all the speakers, and their photos will be up tomorrow. But that action link is up there right now and ready to go. We want you to tell your friends, spread the word about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. It's got to spread around the whole world, because we have a big job to do to get our emissions down 7% a year. We haven't really started. We had a little help from COVID in terms of reducing emissions, but even that didn't take us down 7%. So we need to do that. Please sign a survey. I believe a survey link will show up in the chat for you. And we'd love you to fill it in so that we can follow up with you. If you're in Toronto, we would match you with others in your ward to go and meet with your councillor. It really makes a difference if they know that this is a concern from their constituents. They don't care about us organizers over here. They don't care about us, but you, if you're in their ward, they do care about you. So you can put your name, your name and your ward or councillor's name or your postal code in the chat directed to Fatma. She will collect that information, or you can put it on the survey link if you're good enough to follow that link and give us some basic information. We're also interested if you're from other jurisdictions. Okay, we also wanted to say to you that at the Ontario provincial level, you can take action in support of fossil fuel phase out by supporting the campaign to phase out gas power plants. City Hall has already given its support for telling the provincial government, don't bring more gas plants online for electricity. That's recarbonizing the grid, and we can't do that. But the Independent Electricity System Operator, known as IESO, they are currently conducting an assessment of this proposal, and we only have a few days more. I think it's the 17th. We have 3 days to give in our views. There are petitions at the link that I believe is going to appear in the chat, put together by the Ontario Clean Air Alliance and calling for the phase out of Ontario gas plants. So, Angela, are you there to do a little bit more?
Yes.
Okay.
So this concludes our evening. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of our speakers. It's been such an honor and privilege to learn from you, to be inspired by all of you tonight. Thank you to Councillor Christine Boyle, Councillor Mike Layton. I think we have other representatives from the members of Parliament here, members of Provincial Parliament, Jill Andrews, Peter Tobins, and any other representatives here. We're happy that you came to hear about the initiative. And a special thank you to Councillor Mike Layton for introducing the motion to Toronto City Council in July.
Okay, and before you go, we're aware that you may have questions. So please put your questions in the chat and we will put a FAQ on our website. So we'll give you that link. We'll send a follow-up letter and we'll give you that link. So we're happy to have your questions. And over to you, Aviva.
Yeah, thank you to our tech team, Tim Ellis and Mark Chaplin. Thank you to all the organizers for their many hours put into this event and this campaign. And a special thank you to Lynn Adamson for her vision, leadership, and hard work. This evening really would not have happened without her. And last but not least, thank you so much for showing up and spending your Monday evening with us. Be sure to follow up by taking action. There's a link in the chat. Send that letter to your councillor and be sure to sign up on the Google form in the doc if you'd like to be further involved in this campaign. Tell your friends and spread the word about the fossil fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and the vote coming to Toronto City Council this July. We really need to make this movement as large and as powerful as we can. Thank you so much.
And for those of you not in Toronto, we encourage you to invite your municipal and federal leaders to join this campaign. It's open to everyone to sign on. So that's individuals and groups. Any individual and group that you're part of, please sign on. That's fossiltreaty.org. And we've talked about the province, which is really a big job for us. We need to take on the province. But really what we're here about tonight is to help grow the movement worldwide. The crises facing our world today are massive, but we can make a more just and livable world together. One step at a time, being here, sending a letter, making the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty a reality in Toronto and around the world is such an important step. Thank you for being here and taking action. So good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
And we could stay on with presenters for a little bit if you would like to just debrief.
Sure.
We'll just give it a minute.
Then I'm going to put a halt to the recording.
Okay, thank you.